Okay, hi everyone. I want to apologize. I believe someone was trying to ask a question at the end of last week's class. For some reason, my I wasn't able to hear what the person was saying. So if anyone has a question at the end of Shir, I would recommend that you post it as a text on the chat so that I can see it. Thank you. We are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. We are doing so for webyeshiva.org. This is Danielle Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario. And we are in the third section of the Rambam. We're going to do chapter 38, which is a very short chapter, and then we're going to start chapter 39 today. Something very exciting happened this week. I received in the mail my copy of the new translation of the Guide for the Perplexed. And I'm quite excited to go through it. Already in preparing for the shir today, I make note of the fact that it has some wonderful footnotes, and the translation is really quite interesting, very different from the Shlomo Pines edition, which is what we're using. In a way, I regret not having had this translation by Professor Len Goodman up until now. It's got some really fantastic footnotes and references to Aristotle and many of the Islamic philosophers from whom the Rambam is drawing. And I look forward to gaining much knowledge from it. And I recommend that if you are a serious student of the guide, that you pick up a copy and let us know what you think. It's a much more contemporary language, perhaps a bit more informal, and some people may be happy with that, and some people may be less happy with that. It's really a matter of taste. Okay, so I'd like to begin our discussion of chapter 38 today. I'm going to share my screen with you, and let's start off. This is a very short chapter. You know that we're in the middle of the Rambam's going over the 14 categories of mitzvot that he started back in chapter 35. But even before then, as we discuss the Rambam's Ta'amei HaMitzvot, it's important to recall that from chapter 27, the Rambam had stated emphatically that the objective of all the mitzvot is to engender within man a perfection of the body, which in turn leads to a perfection of the soul. In other words, there's a two-pronged approach to the Torah, that a mitzvah will either directly influence a person's soul, which means their intellect, the way that they think, or it will improve their bodily condition, which in turn will enable them to perfect their intellect, perfect their soul. But the ultimate objective is the perfection of what is contained in one's mind, because the knowledge of God and all that exists, that emanates from God, is the ultimate objective of man. Very much an Aristotelian approach to ta'amei ha-mitzvot, to the reasons for the mitzvot. Now, many of the mitzvot that the Rambam discusses in these 14 categories, if you recall, the very first category was a direct approach to a knowledge of God. And that is directly those mitzvot that are contained in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah and the Mishnah Torah, the very first section of the Rambam's Codex of Jewish law, really addresses the ultimate objective of perfecting man's intellect through a proper understanding of God to the best of human ability. But part of perfecting the body is to create societies and social structures which provide mankind with peace of mind and proper associations with other human beings. And just to quote from what the Rambam had said in chapter 27, this is because an individual can only attain all this, bodily perfection, through political, social / social association, it being already known that man is political by nature, meaning that man is a social animal. And this is based on a direct quote from Aristotle in his book on politics. So that's by way of introduction. The Rambam therefore feels that there are many mitzvot that cultivate proper interpersonal relationships and behaviors between complete strangers and neighbors and friends that are contained in the Torah that will improve man's overall emotional and physical condition, which will in turn enable him to turn towards his intellect and work on his perfection of that intellect. Now, as the Rambam had stated in chapter 35, this third category of mitzvot is comprised of those commandments that improve moral qualities. They are all enumerated in the Rambam's section or volume called Hilchot Deot. Now, literally, Hilchot Deot means the laws of opinions, but it really more properly, it refers to laws that engender within man proper moral virtues, the ability to interact with another human being without jealousy, without negative feelings, or without negative behavior. Their benefit, the Rambam says in this very short chapter, is clear and evident, since these qualities are necessary in order to have a properly structured social order. In this category, the Rambam lists mitzvot that do not entail physical performance. As we'll see when we go through a very brief overview of Hilchot Deot in the Mishneh Torah, we will discover that most of these mitzvot really have to do with how a person should either restrain himself in the way that he reacts negatively to others, or encourages proper mental attitudes like ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. So these mitzvot that are contained in Hilchot Deot directly address man's mental and emotional state, as we will see in just a moment. But then the Rambam says, but don't think that the mitzvot in Hilchot Deot, which directly address man's mental and emotional state as far as his moral virtue, are the only mitzvot contained in the Torah which engender and encourage moral virtue. There are many additional mitzvot that are not included in Hilchot Deot that also engender proper moral and ethical conduct. They aren't always self-evident, and sometimes just appear as a gezerat hakatuv, as a divine decree that doesn't seem to have any reason. And therefore, the Rambam says, I will therefore point out these mitzvot in the ensuing chapters as they occur. By contrast, each one of the laws in Hilchot Deot are explicitly given for the purpose of improving a human being's character. So just to, and as I mentioned, I believe last week as well, the Rambam in these chapters where he details the 14 categories of mitzvot relies heavily upon what he already has written in the Mishneh Torah, in his codex. And he sort of assumes that the reader of the Moreh, of the guide, already has a familiarity with the Mishneh Torah, and therefore he doesn't deem it necessary to reiterate things that he's already written there. So, and this is a perfect example. Chapter 38, if the Rambam were to detail that which is contained in Hilchot Deot, the volume on how to achieve proper moral virtue, it would have been a much longer chapter. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take a look at the Hakdama, at the introduction to Hilchot Deot, where the Rambam says that Yesh bichlalan achat esrei mitzvot. There are 11 biblical commandments that are contained in this section of the Mishneh Torah. 5 of them are mitzvot aseh, and 6 of them are mitzvot lo taseh. 5 are positive commandments, thou shalt, and 6 of them are negative commandments, what you're not permitted to do. V'zehu pratan, and this is their list. Number 1, lihidamot bidrachav. The Torah says that we should resemble God. Number 2, lihidavek bioda'av, to cleave unto those who have a knowledge of God, meaning that if you want to be great, you have to stick together with great people, with people who are greater than yourself. Number 3, le'ehov et re'im, ve'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, love your fellow human being. Number 4, le'ehov et hagerim, to love the stranger. And the stranger, of course, usually refers to the ger tzedek, the convert, but it could also refer potentially to others. We'll have to see. Number 5, shelo lisno achim. Now we get into, so we've learned 4 of the positive commandments. Now here's the first of the negative commandments, shelo lisno achim, to not hate your brother. Notice that a reya is different from an ach. A reya is more inclusive of other people, and therefore you have to love as many people as you possibly can. And the prohibition of hating is specifically for your brother, someone who's actually even closer to you. Not literally a brother, but someone who is imitative of your behavior. You're not allowed to hate such a person. Number 6, the final positive commandment is lahochiach, to offer someone rebuke in a gentle way when you feel that you can influence them positively to do better. Number 7, shelo lahalbin panim, not to embarrass someone. And this is especially in conjunction with the mitzvah of tochacha, of rebuke, because the Gemara says that sometimes in the course of trying to do the mitzvah of rebuke, we end up incurring more damage to ourselves and to the other person than the good that we try to perform. So we have to make sure v'lo tisa alav chet, do not embarrass a person in the process of rebuking them. Number 8, shelo la'anot umlalim, not to afflict or oppress those who are downtrodden and those who are the less fortunate elements of society. Number 9, shelo lahaloch rachil, a big one, not to be a talebearer. And we know about all the laws of lashon hara, of gossip and evil speech. And then the last two are shelo linkom, not to take revenge, and shelo lintor, and not even to bear a grudge, even if that's not going to be translated into action. And then he says, "Ubi'er kol hamitzvot ha'elu b'parakim elu," and I will spend the next several chapters explaining these mitzvot. It's also important to note that in this chapter, the Rambam tells us his methodology of how he feels, and this, of course, is based at least partially on Aristotle, how he feels a person can take corrective measures to instill moral virtue into his personality. The Rambam, in the very first chapter of Hilchot Deot, says that every person has a unique makeup of personality and character traits, and therefore a person has to use a tailor-made regimen of self-improvement, because it is certainly true that not one size fits all. He says, every single person is unique in the way that they think, in the way that they approach life, in the way that they look at reality. Vizu mishune mizu urachaka mimenu bioter. People are extremely different from each other. And he gives several examples. We're just going to run through a few quickly. Yesh adam shuhu bal chema ko'es tamid. There are some people who are given to having a temper, and therefore they are much more easily angered. V'yesh adam shedato miyushevet alav ve'eno ko'es klal. And there are other people who are pretty chill. They're not given to becoming upset. He says, "V'yesh adam shuhu givalev bioter, v'yesh shuhu shval ruach bioter." There are other people who are naturally more full of themselves, have a larger ego, and there are some people who have a smaller ego and don't think very much of themselves at all. V'yesh shuhu bal ta'ava lo tispan nafsho mehaloch b'tava. There are other people who are very lustful. They have a naturally greater tendency towards wanting to indulge in all of the pleasures of life. And then there are other people who are naturally not attracted to these kinds of things, to self-indulgence. And therefore, of course, we can't judge the other person, because we all know that each person has a unique temperament. Part of it, and as the Rambam writes, he says that some of these things are inborn, meaning they occur through one's nature. The way that you're born, your genetic makeup in many ways contributes to your personality. And a lot of times these traits are acquired. If a person grows up in a family where everyone's losing their temper and yelling at each other all the time, it's natural for that child to grow up with that kind of tendency, and so forth and so on. And the Rambam then says, Haderech HaYeshara hi midah beinonit shebechol de'ah v'de'ah mikol hadeyot sheyesh lo la'adam. The best way to acquire moral virtue is to try not to be too much of one extreme or too much of the other, but to try to find the midah beinonit, the middle of the road. V'hi hade'ah shehi rechoka mishtei haktzavot richuk shaveh. Right? You want to try and find something right in the middle, equivalently distant from the two polar extremes. And that's the reason why our sages told us adam sam deotav tamid u'misharotam, that a person should always try and measure and do a self-assessment of where he is on this sliding scale of different personality traits. And that's really what's required of every person. And then the Rambam talks about the midat chasidut, the saintly tendency of a person, being even on a higher level to go to, let's say, the extreme of humility or the extreme of not losing their temper. That's chasidut, that's already piety or saintliness. But the proper thing for a righteous person is to at least find himself in the middle of between those two extremes. So there's a lot more to discuss in Hilchot Deot that we're not going to get into now. It's a significant section, but the Rambam assumes that we know it. And the last thing I'm going to mention about chapter 38 is, of course, as the Rambam had said, that should be self-evident that this set of mitzvot are necessary in order for man to structure his society properly, and that the goal, of course, therefore, is that through a fulfillment of these mitzvot, a person will have both bodily and emotional health, and that will enable him to perfect his intellect and reach the ultimate objective of the mitzvot. And it should be noted that here too, the Rambam is seemingly focusing on the utilitarian benefit of proper moral virtues, not as an ends unto themselves, but as a means to the ultimate goal of intellectual perfection and complete attachment to God. And I've commented on this before, that for the Rambam, attaining moral virtue is really just a means to attaining intellectual perfection. It's not that I want to be kind to the orphan and the widow and to be nice to people and speak nicely to them, because that is in itself intrinsically valuable in the larger scheme of things. But rather, the way he presents it here is that it is a means to acquiring intellectual perfection and knowing God as much as possible. There's much more to say about this, because I don't believe that the Rambam didn't think that there was intrinsic value to proper moral virtue. But as it pertains to the project of the guide, which is to lead a person to the fullest understanding of God through Ma'aseh Bereshit and Ma'aseh Merkavah, the act of creation, the act of the chariot, and to really, really know God in the true philosophical sense of knowledge, of philosophia, of a love of knowledge. This, therefore, is the way that the Rambam categorizes the mitzvot. It's clear that he doesn't categorize the mitzvot in the same way in the Mishneh Torah. He doesn't suggest in the Mishneh Torah that this is really just the means to a greater end. So it's really important to keep that in mind. The project of the Moreh is what compels the Rambam to categorize the mitzvot in the way that he does and present the mitzvot in the way that he does. Let's start chapter 39. So we're just going to start it today and we'll conclude it, God willing, next week. This section is all about mitzvot that provide for the poor. And it's a whole category of mitzvot that the Rambam had discussed in chapter 35 to tell us what this category was all about, category 4. This category includes mitzvot of charity, mandatory gifts or tithes, we should say, to the Kohanim, to the Leviim, and the poor, giving loans to people who need money at the moment, proper ethical conduct of one's slaves to make sure that whether it's a Hebrew slave or a Canaanite slave, that they are A, treated with compassion, and B, certainly in the case of the Eved Ivri, the Hebrew slave, that opportunity is given to him to emancipate himself. And the Rambam writes in chapter 35, the reason for all these is manifest, for they are equally useful in turn to all men. For one who is rich today will be poor tomorrow, or his descendants will be poor, whereas one who is poor today will be rich tomorrow, or his son will be rich. And once again, what you're seeing from the Rambam is a utilitarian benefit to society, to the social order, that we as a society have a responsibility to take care of the poor within our society, because ultimately this will benefit every single human being, not just the poor individual, but every member of society. And as our goal, remember, the objective is to enable as many people as possible the opportunity to reach this intellectual perfection, the ultimate goal. Now, many of these mitzvot are contained in a section of the Mishneh Torah called Hilchot Zeraim, which literally means laws of seeds, or really it more generally refers to agricultural halacha. But not all the laws contained there fall in this category. We already explained in the previous chapter, when we were previous two chapters, chapter 37, that when we talked about category 2, laws pertaining to idolatry, that there are certain agricultural laws that were given in the Torah to deter man from worshiping idols, such as the prohibition of kilayim, the prohibition of mixing seeds, which, as the Rambam had explained in chapter 37, was prohibited because people used to mix seeds as a form of theurgy, in their attempt to try and harness the power of the stars. Okay, also contained in, but obviously many of the laws in Hilchot Zeraim have to do with tithing and taking care of the poor, using our agricultural produce as a means of providing for the poor and for the Kohen and the Levi. Also contained in this category are laws from Hilchot Malveh Velove, the laws of lender and borrower, because it is considered to be a way of sustaining the various members of my community who may be less financially fortunate than I am, to loan them money. And it also has many of the mitzvot that are contained in Hilchot Avadim, the laws of slaves, as I mentioned. Now, what do these commandments have in common? So the Rambam writes, they are manifestly useful through instilling pity for the weak and the wretched, giving strength in various ways to the poor, and inciting us not to press hard upon those in straits and not to afflict the hearts of individuals who are in a weak position. So it not only improves every individual's emotional or character development, but it also ends up benefiting every member of society, as I mentioned before. So it's almost like a double benefit. It improves the personality traits and the character of the person who is conditioned to constantly give to the poor, and we'll expand a little bit on that more. And it also benefits every member of society, so that every human being has the opportunity to fulfill the ultimate objective of intellectual perfection, knowing that they will not be destitute and go hungry, but rather that their body will be taken care of. So the first category that the Rambam discusses or the first set of mitzvot, is charity to the poor, tzedakah, and tithes to the Levite and to the Kohen. They are clearly in this category. And the reason why the Levite and the Kohen are included in the category of charity is because about the Levite it states in the Torah, Uba HaLevi, the Levite will come together with the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, and you will give to them whatever you can of your tithes. And why is it important to support the Levi? Ki ein lo chelak v'nachala imach, because he does not have a portion of his own real estate with which to sustain himself. The reason why Hashem did not give the Levites their own real estate was in order for them to be fully engaged in divine service and knowledge of the Torah. As it says later on in Deuteronomy, Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'toratecha liYisrael. When Moshe blesses the tribe of Levi, which includes the Kohanim as well, he gave them the blessing that their role is to give instruction of the law to Jacob, meaning the Jewish people, and the Torah to all of Israel. And so because they have this very demanding role of being the educators and the spiritual mentors and guides for the rest of the Jewish people, they are exempt from having to work the soil in an agricultural society, which could potentially deter them from that task, and that's not what God wants. And this is why the Levi is grouped together in Scripture with the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. The common denominator is that all these people are financially vulnerable, and therefore it is the obligation of the rest of the community to help sustain them. Another category or another set of mitzvot contained in this is what's called ma'aser sheni, or literally the second tithe. Whenever a person tithes his field, he has to give the first 10% as truma and as ma'aser rishon. He's got to give the first tithe to the Kohen, a small amount. He's then got to give 10% of what remains to the Levite, and then he's got to give another 10%. It is called ma'aser sheni. And in this category, in this halacha, he's allowed to consume that second 10%, but he has to take his produce and bring it to Jerusalem and consume the produce there. The reason for this mitzvah is that it engenders further charity. That's the Rambam's thesis, that this mitzvah of ma'aser sheni, of taking a percentage of my produce and eating it myself, but doing so in the city of Jerusalem, will engender more charity. A person must consume all his produce in Jerusalem. What a person can do is a person can do something called pidyon, which is, let's say I have a very large amount of produce and it's not practical for me to schlep all of my produce to Jerusalem, if I live in Haifa and I've got cartloads of grain, what I can do is I can transfer the value of the grain onto coinage, take those coins and bring them to Jerusalem, but then I have to spend those coins on consumable items. I can't buy clothing with my Meiser Sheni coins. I can only buy food and bring my family and feed my family and stay in Jerusalem until all of that money is spent. But since in most cases this cannot be practically done because a person may be may have a huge amount of produce, and it's not practical for him to consume all of it in Jerusalem in such a short amount of time, this will lead the farmer to distribute much of his Ma'aser Sheni to the poor of Jerusalem. So therefore, the Rambam's thesis, even though this is not contained at all in the verses of the Torah, there is not even an allusion to this that I'm aware of in the words of our sages, but nonetheless, the Rambam believes that Ma'aser Sheni also engenders the giving of charity. Jerusalem thus becomes a focal point of gathering and causes brotherhood and love among the people to be greatly strengthened. In other words, what it does is that it engenders not only the giving of charity, but it also engenders a feeling of community. Everyone gathers together in Jerusalem. We all feel that we're part of a mishpacha, we're part of a big family, and everyone is enhanced in the process. So that could be said that there's truth to that even today, that the central meeting place of all Jews is the city of Jerusalem. And I just want to point out that it just was to me a chidush, it's to me a novelty that the Rambam uses this as his explanation for why Ma'aser Sheni is a mitzvah of virtue and value in improving the human and Jewish condition, because not it is not at all akin to what the Rambam had stated about Neta Revai, which we'll discuss below, which needs to be brought to Jerusalem. That we discussed in chapter 37, that the produce that grows from my tree in the fourth year, the first 3 years it's orla, the fruit cannot be consumed at all. And in the fourth year, what's called Neta Revai, that produce has to be brought to Jerusalem as well. And therefore, there's a commonality between the law of Neta Revai, the produce of the fourth year of my tree, and Ma'aser Sheni, which is from my agricultural produce, my grain, and so forth. 10% of it has to be brought up to Jerusalem for consumption. In chapter 37, the Rambam had said that the reason why I have to bring my Neta Revai to Jerusalem is because there might be a temptation to use it for idolatrous purposes, and therefore bring it to Jerusalem to remind you that you have to use it in the service of God instead. Here, the Rambam says nothing like that. There is no special quality as far as holiness and as far as the service of God about Jerusalem to be contained in this explanation of Maaser Sheni, other than the fact that it's a great central location for everyone to get together and to meet. It does not take into account, as I write here, the unique status of Jerusalem in contradistinction to others like the Sefer HaChinuch, who also explains the reason for the mitzvot, but in mitzvah 360, where he talks about another mitzvah having to do with bringing one's tithe to Jerusalem, he's talking about what's called ma'aser behema. He's talking about tithing every 10th animal and dedicating it to God. But what do you do when you tithe your animals? You have to bring that animal up to Jerusalem, offer it as a sacrifice, at least the intestines of the animal as a sacrifice, and consume the animal in Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, the Sefer HaChinuch writes that doing so in the holy city of Jerusalem, where the Sanhedrin is located, which is the seat of great Torah knowledge for the Jewish people, this will encourage within each Jewish family that there will be at least one member of the family who will always come to Yerushalayim, interact and mingle with the rabbinic community, and therefore every family will have within it someone who becomes a Talmud Chacham. And therefore, Uvechein timalei haaretz de'at Hashem. So the Sefer HaChinuch understands the reason why the Torah encourages us for various mitzvot, like Neta Revai, like Ma'aser Sheni, like Ma'aser Behema, why God wants us to bring our tithes to Jerusalem is for the purpose of increasing knowledge of the Torah and getting ourselves spiritually attuned through the study of Torah that is more prevalent and more intense in the holy city of Jerusalem. The Rambam doesn't say that at all. The Rambam says this is to increase brotherhood and a sense of community. So therefore, if I live out in a far-flung moshav out in the middle of the hinterlands, by coming to Jerusalem periodically, I get to interact with other Jews. I get to share my produce with them, and I feel a sense of belonging to a greater community. And that, again, going back to the idea that man is a social animal, helps a person physically, emotionally, and mentally to achieve that ultimate objective, like we mentioned before. Now, in defense of the Rambam's opinion, we note that Maaser Sheni is brought in the first, second, and fourth, and the fourth and fifth years of the Shemitah cycle, whereas in the third and the sixth year of the Shemitah cycle, one takes that additional 10%, and instead of bringing it up to Jerusalem, they use it for what's called Maaser Oni, by distributing it directly to the poor of one's own community. So what the Rambam seems to be essentially doing is that he's creating a thematic commonality between Maaser Sheni and Maaser Oni. Both of them are for the purpose of providing for the poor. Maaser Sheni, which is done 4 out of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, requires me to bring my tithe to Jerusalem and share it with the poor of Jerusalem, and to create a sense of community in Jerusalem with my fellow Jews. And in 2 out of the 7-year Shemitah cycle, I'm supposed to distribute that same charity to the members of my own community. So it seems that perhaps the Rambam, because of that association between Maaser Sheni and Maaser Ani, is creating this thesis as to the objective of the mitzvah. The next type of mitzvah that the Rambam describes in this chapter is Neta Revai, the produce which he had already talked about in chapter 37, as I mentioned before. Produce of the 4th year of a tree's growth and other first gifts are also in this category. And with this, we're going to conclude. We mentioned in chapter 37 that just as Orla, the produce of a tree's first growth within its first 3 years, is prohibited to prevent idolatrous practices that were done to accelerate a tree's growth, this mitzvah was given to prevent people from bringing their first produce to foreign deities instead of God. And therefore God says, yes, it's part of your first produce, and you may be excited and you may want to, as the pagan priests tell you to, continue the blessing of this tree by offering the first fruits to the pagan deities. And therefore the Torah says, no, instead bring the first fruits that you're permitted to consume, bring it instead to Jerusalem. Additionally, though, the Rambam writes, consistent with the theme of this chapter, which is to provide for others, this mitzvah engenders a moral quality within man of eschewing and rejecting one's lusts and desires. And this too, again, just like the mitzvah of charity is meant to engender within man not only providing for the poor, but engendering within man a sense of pity and compassion for others, this also is a character-building mitzvah. And this is in the category of what the Rambam had written in chapter 38, that along the way, when we go through various individual mitzvot, I will point out to you when a mitzvah is there to engender a moral quality within a human being. This is a perfect example, that the obligation to take my first fruits that grow from my tree that I'm allowed to benefit from and bring them up to Jerusalem will cause me to remember that as much as I would love to take a bite out of that first apple that is growing on my tree that I'm allowed to benefit from, I'm going to first bring it up to Jerusalem, and this will curb my appetite for self-indulgence. The Torah commands us to bring the first of everything we produce to God as a way of strengthening man's quality of generosity to others and weakening man's appetite for self-gratification. Included in this category are many other mitzvot. Truma, taking the first fruit up from my wheat field and giving it to the Kohen. The challah tithe, when I make a new batch of dough, I have to tear off a corner of that dough and give it to the Kohen. Instead of baking it for myself first, no, I put aside the very first part of that challah dough and I give it instead to the Kohen. Bikurim, first fruits, which we'll talk more about next week, and Reshit HaGeiz, and the first shearings of my sheep, which I would normally like to take for myself to make my woolen garments. No, I have to give the first of everything that I produce and give it instead to Hashem. Also included are the gifts to the Kohen of special parts of the animal's body. The Torah says in Deuteronomy chapter 18 that I'm obligated to give hazeroa v'halachayim v'hakeva, the shoulder, the jaws, and the stomach to the Kohen of every animal that I slaughter. These, the Rambam states, represent primary parts of the animal's body. The jaws are a primary part of the body because it's the most prominent thing that you see when you look at a cow. You see it chewing its cud, and you see that's a primary part of the animal as it presents itself. The shoulder is the right shoulder and represents the first part of the extremities of the animal. And the stomach is the first of all of the intestines. So the Rambam sees in this mitzvah also the same theme as bikurim, as first fruits, as reshit hagez, the first shearings, as truma, as neta revai. All of them are taking the things that I harvest first and what I normally and naturally would want to take for myself, and instead share it with the Kohen. And I just want to finish off by saying that this too is a novelty in the Rambam's approach to these mitzvot, because as the Sefer HaChinuch writes, he has a totally different reason why we have to give the Zeroa L'chayim and Keva, the shoulder, jaws, and stomach, to the Kohen. Based on what the sages tell us, that this was a reward to the personality Pinchas that is found at the end of Parshat Balak and the beginning of Parshat Pinchas, who, because of his act of zealotry, used his mouth, used his shoulder, and used the stomach in order to commit an act of zealotry for God. And he used his mouth through prayer, and he used his arm to strike the spear into the stomach of two people who were sinning in the presence of everyone. And as a reward, all Kohanim from that day forward were granted the shoulder, the jaws, and the stomach. The Rambam does not subscribe to that. The Rambam feels that, I guess perhaps you could argue, he feels that in a sense does not really is not really consistent with the theme of the mitzvot as he understands them, at least for the purposes of the guide. And therefore he tells us how this is going to engender, by giving the Kohen these gifts, specifically how this will engender within myself proper moral qualities, which in turn will allow me to obtain the ultimate objective of intellectual perfection. So there we have it for today. I'm going to stop my share so that if there are any questions, as I mentioned before, I apologize to those who tried to ask a question and I couldn't hear it. If anyone has something in the chat that they'd like to ask, and then we'll end it for today. Not every Kohen is from Pinchas, Debbie asks. Yes, that's true. But Pinchas, through his act of zealotry, protected or gave merit to all other Kohanim in his entire tribe, because he represents the sort of the quintessential Kohen. Okay. I'm going to call it a date, call it for today. Let me wish you all a wonderful week. And Bezrat Hashem, we will be on for next week, where we will finish off chapter 39, go through some more of the agricultural mitzvot that are consistent with the theme that the Rambam is presenting us with. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.